Okay, so today we're going to be wrapping up our work on solving quadratic equations. You'll notice that the learning target here says I can solve a quadratic equation using one or more methods of solving. So the goal of this lesson is really just to summarize and sort of synthesize all of the methods of solving a quadratic equation that we've learned about so far in Unit 8. So what I'd like you to do for your do now is just pause this video and try to make a list of all of the different methods that we have learned to solve quadratic equations. Okay, so the first method that we learned is using square roots. Now these were the first two lessons that we learned about in this unit. They were both from the last packet, Solving Quadratic Equations Part 1. This is when we just have one x that shows up in our equation and we just use inverse operations and square roots to solve for x. The second method that we learned about was factoring. Now we learned two different ways to solve by factoring depending on the type of problem that we had. We have factoring when a is 1 and we have factoring when a is not 1. Now for both of those methods, our equation needed to be in standard form and then we could use factoring to solve. The third method that we learned about in our next lesson was called completing the square. So this method is a little bit different than all the other ones. And the last method that we learned about in our last lesson is the quadratic formula. So again, these are the four methods that we've learned to solve quadratic equations. Our goal in this lesson is to figure out why we might use one method over the other, or how we can recognize when one method might be the easiest. So for this lesson, you're going to need to be on page 13 in your Solving Quadratic Equations Part 2 packet. I want you to start by taking a look at this problem. This example here is asking you to solve this equation right here, and notice that they solved it using three different methods. You could not solve this one using inverse operations and square roots because we had two different x's in our equation. We had an x squared and a regular x. So instead we could either factor, complete the square, or use the quadratic formula. So right now I'd like you to pause this video and think about these two turn and talk questions as you read through the work. Okay, so what you should have noticed here is that no matter which method you used, you still got the same answer of -6 and -1. So let's start with question number 1. It says, what is unique, which means different or special, about the completing the square method? So if you'll notice in the completing the square method, the first thing that they did is they moved this 6 to the other side, to the right side. So that means that they were getting it out of standard form. So what makes completing the square unique is that we do not want standard form. In this method, we instead move that c term over to the other side to get it out of standard form. Then we do our half square share. Now the second method is really just a personal preference. Which method would you have chose to solve this equation and why? So just to walk through the methods, in factoring we asked ourselves what multiplied to 6 and added to 7, and that was +6 and +1. We then used our zero product property to solve each equation and get our two answers. In B, we moved the 6 to the other side. We did our half square share to get 49/4. We then factored the left side and simplified the right side, took the square root, and used our inverse operations. In letter C, we just identified our A, our B, and our C value, and we substituted those into the quadratic formula. We simplified and got our answer. So for me, I would probably not have chose the completing the square method because of these fractions here. The fact that 7 is an odd number makes this problem a little bit trickier. I personally would have probably picked factoring since this question was very easily factorable, or I could have also used the quadratic formula since I know that that method always works. So taking a look at the bottom of page 13, this is a great chart that reviews the four methods of factoring. I tell you when you can use them and I provide different examples. So just to review some key points here, you'll notice for the square roots method, this you can only use when there is one x. So you'll notice the equation either looks like this or like this, and I simply just use my inverse operations. The next three methods I use when there's two x's, meaning an x squared and a regular x. You'll notice that in both factoring and the quadratic formula, you want your equation to be in standard form, meaning everything is on one side with a 0 on the other side. But in completing the square, this is when you don't want it in standard form because you move that term, your c term, to the other side. Notice that for factoring, you can only use this method if you can actually factor. Not every trinomial is factorable, but I would definitely always check for this method first to see if you can use that. The quadratic, completing the square, we only really learned how to do this when you have an invisible 1 out front. And like I mentioned in the mini lesson, it's easiest to use when b is an even number. So when you do your half square share, you don't end up with any fractions. And then the cool thing about the quadratic formula is that this method always works. So when in doubt, you could always use that method. So let's flip to page 14. I want you to take a look at this guided practice problem. You're given x squared plus 4x plus 3 equals 0, and you're being asked to solve it using at least two different methods. So from those four methods that we just went over, please pick two of them and solve this equation, and then come back to check your answers. Okay, so by now you should have tried the guided practice, thinking about which methods you could use. You could not have used the square root method because there are two different x's here. I have an x squared and I have an x. So in this case, I could not have used the square root method. That would not have worked. However, you could have done factoring. You could have done completing the square. And you could have also done the quadratic formula. So let's take a look at how your work would have looked using any of those three methods. So here's the work for three different methods. You'll notice that no matter which method I chose, I ended up with the answer of -1 and -3. So if you were factoring, you asked yourselves what multiplied to +3 and added to +4, and that would be +1 and +3. You use your zero product property and you use inverse operations to get your two answers. If you did completing the square, you would have started by moving that 3 over to the other side by subtracting. You would have taken your b term, half of 4 is 2, 2 squared is 4, so half square share, you would add that to both sides. You would have factored the left side and simplified the right side. Take the square root of both sides, subtract 2, 1 minus 2 gives you -1. -1 minus 2 gives you -3. So the same answers. For the quadratic formula, you would have identified that your a value was an invisible 1, your b value is +4, your c value is +3. Substituting those into the quadratic formula and simplifying would have still given you -1 and -3. So again, notice that no matter which of these methods you chose, you should have had the same answer. At this point, we're ready for our checkpoint question. So this question says that you're given x squared minus 9x plus 20. You are going to choose this time only one method. We gave you the choices here. You can either choose factoring, you can choose completing the square, or you can choose the quadratic formula. Please just pick one of those methods, solve this equation, and then come back and check your work. Okay, so taking a look, here are the answers for the checkpoint question. You'll notice that using all three methods, I got an answer of +4 and +5. So I want you to take a look at the work for each method and compare it to how your work was. Okay, so as we get into our independent practice, I want you to think about if you were not able to solve this equation, you weren't even really quite sure which method to pick, and you really couldn't get started with an equation, I want you to start in red. If you maybe picked one of the methods and you tried to solve, but you made some sort of minor error along the way, please start with yellow. And if you were correctly able to choose one of those methods and solve, I'd like you to start in green. You'll notice that all of these questions are on page 14. Again, if you're picking red, I'd like you to do red and yellow. If you're picking yellow, please do yellow and green. And then green, you definitely want to answer that green problem. And I would also start on the extension. No matter what group you're in, I want you to notice at this point, these are all of the questions that you know how to do in your Regents packet right now. Again, all of these came from the last couple of lessons of solving. So if you haven't yet started these questions in your Regents packet, I would definitely give that a try. So at this point, I'd like you to pause this video, go take about 10 to 15 minutes to work on your independent practice, and then come back here to check your answers. Okay, so let's take a look at our answers for the independent practice. Here are all 4 answers on page 14. Go ahead and pause this video to take a look. You'll notice that for each question 1, 2, and 3, you could have solved it using a different method. I picked whatever method I personally thought would be the easiest, but you should still get the same answer as me no matter which method you chose. So again, in order to get your classwork credit for this lesson, we need you in Google Classroom to submit a picture of your checkpoint question and a picture of which of these 4 problems that you are working on in order to get your credit. The last thing we'd like you to do, just to summarize the first half of Unit 8, is think about which method do you prefer to use when solving quadratic equations. So again, just to review our different methods, we have square roots, we have factoring, we have completing the square, and we have the quadratic formula. So I want you to think about, from these 4 methods, which one do you prefer and find the easiest, and also how do you know when you can use these methods? Again, there are great notes to use back on page 13 of your packet. Please just think about this question to sort of summarize all of the work that we've done with solving quadratic equations.